Hello, and thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Creedal Catholic. Creedal Catholic is a Catholic theology and apologetics podcast that is faithful to the magisterium and dedicated to the mission of the new evangelization. We're a part of the Vernacular podcast network, and if you'd like to support us or find out more about the other shows on our network, head to patreon.com/VPN or vernacularpodcast.com. Patreon.com/VPN or vernacularpodcast.com. Enjoy the show. All right, welcome back to another episode of Creedal Catholic, and specifically today, another episode of Encyclicalpedia. I'm joined by my new favorite interlocutor for theology, Kevin Beauchemin. He's sitting across from me at the desk here. And Kevin, you've had a busy week, I know, but as I understand it, you're no closer to being a Dominican than when we talked about this last.
Lay Dominican?
Oh, lay Dominican.
Closer.
Okay.
Closer, actually, yes.
Okay, good. What about a priest Dominican? A religious Dominican?
Wow. Well, you're always throwing that one at me. It's it's funny, but you did prepare me for this. You told me this was going to happen.
I did. So you have a witty comeback all prepared.
I do not have a witty comeback prepared. But since last week you didn't include me in the conversation with Father Sharapa. I'm not bitter. I don't love Father Sharapa or anything. I mean, I love Father Sharapa.
Right.
Great guy. Great priest. Very holy priest.
Yes.
You had a great conversation, and discernment is hard. So
are you criticizing me for not inviting you to that conversation?
No, you're laying a trap for me. You're laying a trap for me because you knew that I just couldn't do it because of a schedule.
Because I did invite you.
You're right.
Well, your scheduling conflict was you've been asked to be the leader of a parish committee that's planning a parish event, right?
Correct.
And I have a lot of respect for you with respect to that.
Oh, wow.
Because
only with respect to that.
Only with respect to that. Yeah, don't get carried away here. Because I think, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, that to me is the true test of leadership. Can you successfully navigate the dynamics of a parish committee?
The dangerous waters of a parish committee.
That's a tall order to head up a parish committee.
Oh, no, I'm very fortunate. We have a really great team, very invested individuals with a lot of experience. So it's an expedition. We're planning an expedition with Core Expeditions, which is a ministry out in Wyoming. And they plan these great trips to basically go out in the wilderness, and it's kind of a leadership thing. You can do rock climbing, rafting, whatever you want to do. They have really experienced guides, and the whole idea is to kind of get people out of the city, out of their comfort zones a little bit. In God's
creation.
Get them into God's creation, test their limits, see what they can learn about themselves, about other people in the parish, all with a lot of good faith formation going on at the same time. So,
is this a multi-day event or is it a day trip?
It's multi-day. So this is going to be the second iteration of it. Last year, really this past summer, before I was in Denver and before I was a part of this parish, they had a very successful trip. So they're looking to continue that momentum, and hopefully I do not stunt their growth too much.
It sounds awesome. And Colorado's a great place for it because the mountains are so close. So
yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to be great. So it's, St. Dominic's Parish is putting it on. And if you're in the Denver area, you might see something about it, and in the coming months, maybe early next year, we probably put something out.
So St. Dominic's is hosting it, but this is open to people of all parishes.
We're going that direction, most likely.
Cool.
So it just depends. We'll see what the interest is at the parish first, and then anticipate probably opening it up to other members of the archdiocese as well. So,
well, I'm interested in if it's open to
Excellent.
members of the neighboring diocese down here in Colorado Springs, the little brother of the archdiocese.
Yeah, well, we'll see. As a friend of the archdiocese, you might be able to do it.
We'll see. No. It's all about who you know.
Sure.
Well, I am excited to talk about our encyclical topic today, Kevin. But before we do, I want to do a little bit of critical self-reflection here.
Ooh, we're getting personal.
Yeah. So this past weekend, you were with me, actually. We were hanging out, and I responded to an email on a listserv. And it was a poor choice to respond to this email, and it was an even more poor choice to respond in the way that I did. And the content was theological, but my contribution to the listserv was, I would describe it as cheeky rather than like substantive and scholarly. And it spiraled out of control, and things got contentious quickly, and I quickly regretted my action and then tried to tried to calm things down by sending a subsequent one and explaining further what I was thinking, and then basically saying, let's not engage over this. Let's correspond privately if you want to talk more about this, but I don't want to instigate more on this listserv. And I was just thinking about this. It was good. I mean, I was not glad that it was happening in the moment, but I think it was good that it did happen, because I took away from that electronic mediums or electronic media are very difficult channels to have these conversations about topics that people have very strong opinions.
Sure.
The nature of this discussion specifically was about Protestant Catholic divides, and those are things that people get very sensitive about. And as Catholics, we need to handle those things with sensitivity and care, always making sure that we're pointing people closer to the truth rather than making them react defensively in a way that draws them further away from it.
So, I think that's really good self-reflection. What would you say, like, how do you think, if you could go back in time, how would you handle that situation? Would you just not respond, or do you think? I think I just wouldn't have responded. Yeah.
I mean, and I think if something needed to be said on that, then I could have said it, but in this specific instance, nothing needed to be said.
It's definitely a temptation, right? Because especially when you are smart on a certain topic, or at least perceive yourself to be smart on a certain topic, as I often find out that I'm not as smart on this topic as I thought I was after engaging someone. But it's a temptation, because even if the will is good behind it, like you said, oftentimes email, things like that, just they don't go over that well.
Well, and I find that my pride doesn't let me easily leave a conversation alone. And, so I can make a cheeky comment, which is not constructive, but then if someone else responds with a more serious response about all the ways in which I'm wrong, it's very, very difficult for me to walk away from that, because I think I can back up what I'm saying, and I really want to. And then it can very easily devolve into this 24-part thread, because neither me nor my interlocutor wants to let the other have the last word. Mm-hmm. And so it, I ended up bowing out of the conversation, and there were others who did have the last word. And that was a good exercise in, humility for me to let that be the case, because you can't control what people say about you or what people think about you. And at a certain point, you just have to, cut your losses when you realize that you're not making any progress. And it was convicting too, for me to realize that maybe I didn't handle that in the best way, and I could have drawn people further away from the truth rather than towards it, which was certainly not my intent, but perhaps an effect of my misguided
unintended
action.
Side effect.
Yeah.
I think, kind of talking about humility and being humble, it's definitely a challenge. I'm struggle with humility, certainly. And, I think we had a really great gospel reading this last Sunday. We had a good example of humility, right, in the prodigal son, where he, after going out and being a spendy guy and kind of enjoying the material aspects of life, realized that he had kind of missed out on what really mattered, right? And I think one of the great takeaways from that gospel is that he had the humility to go back.
That's true. Yeah.
It's hard. I think it's hard, especially when you look at the gravity of what he had done in that scenario, to admit to yourself you've done wrong. And, what he says in that gospel about, I'll go back and I'll ask only to be a servant in the field and be treated as a servant. And I think it's an incredible witness about how humility is answered by grace when you return home. Right.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's a good setup for our discussion today.
I think so.
We're talking about the encyclical Deus Caritas Est. And I was thinking about this I was thinking about my sort of listserv faux pas as I was reading this encyclical, because Benedict's whole thrust in writing this is to remind us that Deus Caritas Est, that is, God is love, from 1 John chapter 4. And because of that reality, because that reality is so fundamental to the truth of the Christian faith, everything we do as Christians needs to remind people of that reality. Mm-hmm. And if you are not doing that, then quite simply, you're doing it wrong. So if what you're saying is not pointing people towards the truth that God is love, then you're doing it wrong. Mm-hmm. And one way that you can fall into that trap is by not treating people with love yourself. And that's an important thing to remember. when you're dealing with people of all stripes, inside the church or outside of the church, to treat them with love. But Deus Caritas Est. So this was published on Christmas Day, 2005.
We need like a nice Encyclicalpedia bumper or something. You're going to have to work on this as our de facto producer.
Okay. Let me just get on the Encyclicalpedia jingle there. I'll just record a little song.
There you go.
Encyclicalpedia, Encyclicalpedia, Encyclicalpedia. So Christmas Day 2005, this was the first encyclical of Benedict's pontificate. Mm-hmm. And this is really part of a trilogy of encyclicals in his pontificate. One is this one, the first one. This is about love. The second one is Spe Salve, which is about hope. And then the third one is Caritas in Veritate, which is basically love in truth. So you sense a theme here. He wants to remind us of our role as Christians and the role of the church in love. And that's a unique thing. Benedict is a pope who's been criticized roundly, especially by progressive elements inside and outside of the church, for being hard-headed and stubborn and lacking charity. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that this pope, who is accused frequently of lacking charity, for example, people point to his, I read somewhere today, someone was calling his Regensburg address disastrous. I think it was in reality far from that, but he's accused of lacking charity. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a very unfair accusation. And these two encyclicals remind us how preoccupied this man was and is, I mean, he's still alive, with the idea of love and how well the church is fulfilling Christ's mandate of love. Yeah,
absolutely. This was his favorite of the encyclicals that he wrote. So in his kind of interview, last book, The Last Testament, he talks about this and he mentions that this is his favorite encyclical. And, when you read it, you can kind of tell why, because it's short, it's, 30-ish pages, but it's like, I think I was throwing you like fire emojis while I was reading it.
It's a little fiery. There's a little fire coming through. The thing that I really appreciate about reading this encyclical, or for that matter, anything Benedict has written, is you get a very strong German analytical sense whenever you read anything that he writes, in the sense that there's no wasted word, there's no wasted space. Everything flows very clearly. It's all written almost in outline form. And it's very easy to follow the argumentation. Mm-hmm. And I absolutely love that. And I found that it was so useful in this case too, and helped to break down the complicated topics he's talking about in the space of, like you said, 30 pages or so. So the format is there's two big parts of this. The first part is really a philosophical examination of love, and love not just as it appeared in antiquity, but as it is restated or reformed in Christian theology. And the second part is sort of an application of those ideas, turning the ideas of love in the systematic and moral theology that he's talking about into a sort of practical theology and how that's lived out in the church today. And I think we should just sort of follow the structure of the encyclical, because it is so well organized and done so in an analytical fashion. And he starts out talking about the semantics of love. And one of the things that stuck out to me when I was reading this is he talks about how we overuse and often misuse the word love so much.
Right.
And I was talking about this with my daughter at dinner, who asked me, I think I said, I love chocolate. And she has a little stuffed animal named Gerald. And she told me before that Gerald really, really likes chocolate. And so I said, I love chocolate.
Convenient.
Yeah, exactly. I noticed that Gerald shares a lot of the same characteristics that I do. Yeah. So anyway, I said, I love chocolate just like Gerald loves chocolate. And she said, he doesn't actually love chocolate. He likes chocolate. And I was thinking, that's a really good point, Esther. I should probably stop saying that I love things like that, because we talk about that all the time, right? Like, you love your favorite food. I love my new car. I love my house. I love my city. But that's not really what love is about. What we're expressing is a certain fondness for those things, an appreciation for the material goodness therein. But we're not talking about love. And I think Benedict was very strong in making this point that when we talk about love, we're talking primarily about affections between people. And he talks about the three types that are in Greek antiquity. And I want you to talk about that because you're the Greek scholar here. but he says chief among those, right, is the love between man and wife. That's sort of the most complete, most perfect example, the pinnacle, if you will, of love, because it's that love that is procreative. It's that love that is unitive. It's that love that inspires great sacrifice. And so the love between man and wife is the highest point. But at the same time, that love was distorted in antiquity. Mm-hmm. And he used the example, I think, of prostitutes in Greek temples, right? Right. So
as part of like the Vestal sacrifices and games and all of that, and the oracles, there was a lot of the religion, especially of ancient Greece, had a very erotic nature to it, for sure.
And that was a corruption of the of eros itself. Now, I mean, he goes on, he talks about how later scholars, Nietzsche chief among them, accused Christianity then of stripping eros of its glory. But Benedict actually says, no, it's the other way around. It was distorted before, and Christianity is what restores it. But before we talk about all of that, maybe you can talk a little bit about the Greek words for love that Benedict analyzes here.
Sure. So he starts, he introduces these three terms: eros, agape, and philia. So the first of those that he talks about is eros, and eros is, the kind of love, it's cognate with erotic. So it's the kind of love that we typically think about when you think of, especially like probably, a sexual love or an attraction between people.
Right.
And so eros, what Benedict is getting at with eros is he says that it's not bad in and of itself because it leads in ascent to higher forms of love. Right. But especially as you alluded to in antiquity, eros is kind of, it's misplaced because it's celebrated as a sort of divine power is what Benedict is saying. And he alludes to some ancient myths and talks about its place and kind of the reason why eros even today appeals to us as human beings. And he talks about how there is a kind of a feeling in the human heart that you are not fully complete until you find another half or another part of you. And one of the kind of highest examples of this, especially in classical in antiquity, in the literature of classical antiquity that Benedict references, is he talks about a myth that Socrates, that he attributes sort of to Socrates he calls it one of Plato's works. And what he's specifically referring to, actually, there is Plato's Symposium, which is Plato's philosophical dialogue on love. And specifically, it focuses a large portion on erotic love. And he talks about a myth, and it's a myth that's told by, in this dialogue, told by the poet Aristophanes. So Aristophanes is a poet of and a contemporary of Socrates, so a frequent interlocutor. And it's interesting, the relationship, especially between Socrates and Aristophanes, because you have the philosopher on one end and the poet on the other. So in some sense, you would say you have a discoverer of truth on one end and a creator or manufacturer of truth on the other. But ultimately, the point of this is that Aristophanes tells this myth about how human beings were all originally spherical and kind of in one, and then as a punishment, the gods cleaved us all in half, and we're now kind of put into the world and constantly searching for our other half until we find that. So there's like,
and the search for that other half takes the form of eros, right?
Exactly.
Because it's, and Benedict characterizes it as ascending love, because you're searching for something to complete you, essentially.
Exactly. And so that is, Benedict brings this out as it is important, and it's an essential part of that ascent, because it is kind of the initial movement of your heart that allows you then to reach that higher form, right?
And Benedict points out, in comparing the myth in Plato to the Christian story of man and woman being created, and he says there's no punishment here. But the analogy still does hold, because then Benedict shifts a little bit and talks about how our ascending love, eros in a way, or God's love for us, which is a form of eros that Benedict says is also totally agape, that is created in a sense by punishment. That is original sin, right? Because original sin cuts us off, and we are designed not just for union, man and woman with each other, but humankind is designed for union with God. And so in that sense, not to say that God is one half of humanity or humanity is one half of God, but there is a part of us that is lacking when we don't have communion with God. I don't know if you've heard the phrase. It's a little bit shallow perhaps, but it communicates a truth, I think, which is a God-shaped hole in your heart.
Right.
And so that I think is part of what we're talking about here, that mankind, because of original sin, is cut off from complete union with God. And the story of the Christian life is God's attempt through his eros, which is also totally agape, unconditional love, to reestablish that relationship with us through the love of God.
Right, exactly. And so that word you're using again, agape, is this, of the three loves, it's the highest form, right? And it's the kind that we now, I think, the clearest definition I've ever really heard of it is that agape, or true love, is willing the good of the other. So it is an actual case where it's no longer about, attraction. It's no longer about friendship, which is philia, which is more of a, not so much a erotic love, but philia being the joy you have when you have a friend, or you kind of get some utility out of friendship.
Sort of shared common interest.
Exactly,
or something. Yeah.
Exactly. And it can extend even beyond that into sort of a sacrificial friendship where you're willing to make sacrifices for the good of your friend. But ultimately, agape then being that true mutual feeling of willing the good of the other. And that is...
Well, is it even mutual necessarily, though? Because
it doesn't have to be, right? But I think that's one of the points that Benedict is really making, is that in its highest form, it's going to be mutual, because you look then and you say, if God is going to always love you in that manner, he's always going to be willing your good. And so then if you are truly in love with God, and you kind of feel this other side of that agape relationship, then it is a mutual love. And through that, you're loving God, and God's loving you ultimately leads you then down this road that Benedict takes us, and basically says, Christian love then by that nature implies a love of neighbor, right?
Yeah. The other two things that that have been helpful for me as I think about agape is it's unconditional. So it's not conditional on the recipient.
Right.
As you mentioned, or in addition to what you mentioned. And then the third thing is it's self-giving. So it's willing the good of the other. It's unconditionally willing the good of the other, and it's willing the good of the other, even though it requires you giving something of yourself. And in that context, it's easy to see why that is the highest form of love, because it's not about the giver of the love. It's completely about the receiver of the love. And Benedict points out this is the most commonly used word for love in the New Testament. So already we see from antiquity a shifting of the sort of hierarchy of love, where Christianity is prioritizing or emphasizing the importance of agape, and not just the importance of agape in some abstract sense, but the importance of agape in the sense that God loves us with agape. And Benedict points out that the love of God is eros, because it is designed to help us ascend, and it is designed to help us complete the part of us that is missing, but it is also totally agape in that it is unconditional, in that it is God giving of himself. And then we get to the incarnation.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it always reminds me of, the famous Augustine quote at the beginning of the Confessions about restless hearts, right? Because it goes back then to...
And just what the quote is, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, right?
Right. And it captures this in the sense that your heart is restless because you have this attraction towards God, and because it's the eros that God is using to try to draw you near to him. And then
this is a much more eloquent quote than the God-shaped hole in the heart.
Right.
But it gets at the same idea.
It does. And then it's, until it finds its rest in you. And Benedict hits on this when he talks about agape then being true love in the sense not only of being exclusive, so exclusive in that you love God fully and wholly and exclusively, but also that it's eternal, right? It's forever, and that's what moves it, especially away from eros, which oftentimes is temporal, is sometimes at the mercy of an individual whim, where you're in a mood or in a bad mood or a good mood or whatever. But true agape is completely devoid of that kind of temporal element. And so Benedict says that then this does leave, love truly, agape truly, to be an ecstasy, but not in the momentary sense. It's not, as he calls it, a moment of intoxication, but it's a journey. It's your complete movement out of an inward looking love to an outward looking love towards God. And then that brings you then to that kind of ultimate point is if you're going to love God eternally, you are going to have a moment where you are going to be moved in love towards neighbor, and that's going to stay with you, and it's going to characterize your activity from that point forward.
Yeah, that's a great point, because he talks about this idea in the encyclical at length, and he uses the word encounter. So the love of God is not a static thing that simply exists and is there for us to access, but it's rather a dynamic thing that moves us to action and with which we can actually engage. And because that's the case, because the love of God represents or presents us with an opportunity for encounter, we come away from that encounter changed. And so when God approaches us with his love and we respond to the love, we will not remain unchanged. You know, a couple weeks ago, one of the pastors at my church gave a homily at daily mass, and he made a great point that I'd never thought about before, and that's that the Magi, when they come to visit the child Jesus, they, even under threat from Herod, right? They go to Herod, and they find out that basically he is wanting to kill baby Jesus. And so they fear for their lives from Herod. And so they go to visit Jesus, and then they return by another way. And so I've always read that as, they were afraid of Herod, so they returned by another way. But his point in the text was no one encounters Jesus and remains the same. So we always,
wow, that's incredible.
We always return by another way, right?
That's incredible.
And so the same for the Magi. And I want to read this passage very briefly from Benedict's encyclical here, where he talks a little bit about this sort of eros from God that pulls us, and the agape that transforms us. And he talks about something that Pope Gregory the Great said long ago. So Benedict writes, in the account of Jacob's ladder, the fathers of the church saw this inseparable connection between ascending and descending love, between eros, which seeks God, and agape, which passes on the gift received. In that biblical passage, we read how the patriarch Jacob saw in a dream, above the stone which was his pillow, a ladder reaching up to heaven on which the angels of God were ascending and descending. Isn't that interesting? A particularly striking interpretation of this vision is presented by Pope Gregory the Great in his pastoral rule. He tells us that the good pastor must be rooted in contemplation. Only in this way will he be able to take upon himself the needs of others and make them his own. And there's a Latin phrase that I'm not even going to try to pronounce. St. Gregory speaks in this context of St. Paul, who was born aloft to the most exalted mysteries of God, and hence, having descended once more, he was able to become all things to all men. And he references 2 Corinthians 12 and 1 Corinthians 9. He also points to the example of Moses, who entered the tabernacle time and again, remaining in dialogue with God, so that when he emerged, he could be at the service of his people. Within the tent he is born, this is a quote, within the tent he is born aloft through contemplation, while without he is completely engaged in helping those who suffer. So that gets at the heart of what you were saying just now, Kevin, that this encounter is what changes us. Mm-hmm. And the eros that seeks God then enables the reception of the agape, which is totally self-giving, and it's transformative for the life of the Christian, and then it has very real implications for the life of the church. And there's no better example of this type of love than that of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and that's why Benedict says towards the end of this first section, he talks about how you have to constantly return to the wellspring of love to be rejuvenated, to be able to, again, eliminate that temporal aspect and make it a truly eternal love. You have to return to that wellspring constantly, and that wellspring is Christ himself.
Right. And
so you could say he's basically telling you
to Christ himself.
He's telling you to go to confession and to the Eucharist.
Exactly.
Go to communion.
The Eucharist. So before we talk about Jesus Christ, the incarnate Son of God, and how he embodies love, I just want to make a couple points, because Benedict has this great section in the first part called the newness of biblical faith. And he makes a couple of really profound points here, I think. In distinguishing Christianity from all that has gone before it and all that has come since, he says there are basically two key ideas. One is that there is one God who is the source of all that exists. Now, you might say that's not super original. Well, at the time, it was pretty original, right? Judaism was monotheistic, unlike all of the religions that surrounded it, right? It was much more common to be in some sort of polytheistic civilization.
Right. In civilizations, polytheistic civilizations, where love was one of the divinities.
Right, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So Judaism, and then obviously Christianity, is distinctive in saying there's one God. Now, since that time, obviously, Islam is also a major monotheistic religion. It also says there's one God, the source of all that exists. And it actually criticizes Christianity, of course, for being polytheistic. And it's because Islam misunderstands the doctrine of the Trinity and all these things. But that is a very unique thing, that there's one God who's the source of all that exists. Now, the second thing that Benedict points out that's unique to Christianity, and this is also found in Judaism, but it is communicated more fully and more perfectly in Christianity. That is the fact that this God is love. So, and he uses the word logos, which is the word that is in the beginning of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word. The logos is the source of all that exists, but also the organizing principle of all that exists. And what is the organizing principle of all that exists? Well, 1 John chapter 4, verse 8 tells us that organizing principle is love, right? So the logos is actually love. And so when the logos becomes man incarnate, that man is love. And that man is the most perfect and most visible example of love. And so these two insights about Christianity are really important because no other religion can say those things about its claims. That there's one God who's the source of all that exists, and that one God is love and loves man. Right? He loves his creation.
Right.
He doesn't simply demand obedience or submission from his creation. He doesn't demand obedience contrary to reason. He loves his creation and has ordered his creation in a way that makes himself accessible to his creation. That's the newness of biblical faith, as Benedict describes it. And so in that context, I think maybe we should talk about now the incarnation. Jesus Christ, God made man.
Yeah. So when we look at the incarnation, one of the great portions of the incarnation that sets it away, again, this new biblical way of life, that sets it apart from ancient religion and ancient society is when you look, especially in mythology, Greek mythology, Roman mythology, the gods frequently descend from the heavens, from their place on Olympus or wherever.
So in that sense, Jesus coming to earth isn't totally unique.
It's not completely novel.
In that sense. Yeah.
Right. But the difference being essentially that the gods are in mythology are typically coming for some sort of interaction that is not a fulfillment of agape, of this higher form of love. It's typically either to satisfy some material need, or if it is any sort of love, it's an erotic love. So it's in order to fill, even the gods had this need for eros. So you see figures like Hercules, who is the son of a god and union, a human being. So it's a God-man union. Yeah, exactly. So you see that sort of union take place, and that is sort of the interaction, the extent of the interaction between the gods and the human world. And now in Christ and the incarnation, we see God, who this encyclical has already established as love itself, then entering into human form in order to enter our world, in order to show us that highest form of love, to teach us agape, to teach us the meaning of agape, to show us how to live a life of agape, and then directs us to fulfill it through the ministry of Christ, which is ultimately the ministry of love towards your neighbor.
I love that, and I love how contrasting it with stories in Greek antiquity make it obvious how revolutionary, how revolutionary, right? And so this makes Benedict's point ring even more true to my ears, because he talks about men like Nietzsche who say Christianity takes all the fun away. They strip all the glory out of eros.
It restrains you.
Right. And Benedict is saying, no, it perfects you.
Right.
It lifts you up. Like I forget the exact word he uses, but it's much better, right? It transforms it and it makes it much better. And so in that sense, the Greek gods would come down and have interactions with men that would result in God-man hybrid offspring. But what does our God come do? Our God comes down and dies for us and literally becomes our food. And there's this great passage that struck me in Benedict's encyclical here, where he says that the ancient world had dimly perceived that man's real food, what truly nourishes him as man, is ultimately the logos. Mm-hmm. So think of Greek philosophers who are seeking truth. Right, who sort of reign as masters in our Western tradition, at least. They're seeking truth because that's what truly sustains man. Well, Benedict says, right, you got it, but here's the thing. Our God becomes man and then becomes our actual food. So the logos that you were seeking, you rightly identified as the nourishment for man. And that logos gave himself up after becoming man, taking on our flesh, and then became the food that sustains us. So we have the God who creates us, and then we have the God who voluntarily gives himself up for us so that he can then nourish us. That's super powerful, and that's totally unique, and you won't find any other religion in the history of the world that says that.
Yeah, and this whole kind of episode now brings us to this point where Benedict asserts that through this now sacramental nature, through this communion that we have with Christ, that we now share, because as one community, as one kind of body of Christ, when we go up and celebrate the Eucharist, we are all in communion with everyone else in the church, right? And so you are now all residing in that same love that is God's love, which he has given to us. And now through that communion, Benedict says that love of God and love of neighbor are now truly united. So he is essentially saying that it's through the act of going to communion, of receiving the Eucharist, that it enables us then to step out of our self-centered reality. It enables us to look beyond kind of our human limitations, which encourage us or incite us only to love things we can see, things that are near to us, objects and people who love us back. But through that Eucharistic sacrifice and sharing that with the entire body of the church, he says that's what's allowing us and liberating us then to go and love completely and fully in the way that he does.
Well, I think that's maybe a great opportunity to segue into part 2, where he talks about what this means for the life of the church, because he says that the church has an obligation to carry out love in the world, because we have this great pearl of great price that is the Eucharist. We have the great sacrament of God's love for us. And because we encounter it and because we consume it, we are changed. We cannot, we go home by a different way, right? We cannot be encountered by that love and remain unchanged. So then we have an obligation to show that same agape, the same unconditional self-giving love of God to the rest of the world. And he starts out by citing their early church and saying, first of all, Scripture bears clear witness to this, right? What's the passage in James about pure and undefiled religion, right? To take care of orphans and widows in their distress.
Yes.
And that's one of many examples. Benedict cites a lot of examples from the book of Acts, where the church is clearly taking care of the least among them, distributing goods and sharing everything that they had so that no one would go hungry or go naked. So the church from the earliest days has been mindful of how to show charity to all, inside and outside the church. He also has this great story of Deacon Lawrence. I don't know if you've heard this or if you had heard this before reading the encyclical.
No, I hadn't.
But so I think the Pope is imprisoned at this point. The emperor then says, I'm taking all the money that the church has. Right. And Deacon Lawrence is the administrator, basically in charge of the treasury. And Deacon Lawrence says, okay, I'll show up with with all the treasure in our treasury tomorrow. And so he distributes all the money, and there wasn't much, but he distributes the money that the church did have to the poor. And then he shows up at the emperor's doorstep with all the poor and the lame and the beggars in the city of Rome, and says, these are the true treasures of the church, the least among us.
Got him.
Yeah, got him, exactly. I would have loved to have been there for that. Apparently, I mean, it's an ancient myth. I'm not saying it's not true, but
right.
but it's at least endured this long in the church's history, because the essence of it is true. The idea of it is true in the sense that those are the treasures of the church. So whether or not Deacon Lawrence was able to pull off a dramatic own of the emperor in Rome is sort of beside the point. Right. It's a great illustration of what the church has always viewed as its treasures. And that's the poor, the sick, the needy, the people to whom we can show the most love.
Right. And Benedict says that, very specifically, he says charity is the responsibility of the church. And he, kind of with the Deacon Lawrence story, he talks about how the example of charity is something that then, because it was so powerful, then was sort of co-opted by secular authorities as well, right? So he kind of talks about how Emperor Constantius, who was kind of passed himself off as a good Christian, but was not really much of an actual Christian.
So not a saint, for sure.
Right, exactly. So that led to this sort of crediting of the Christian faith. And then Julian, the Roman Emperor Julian, however, decided to restore paganism in the Roman Empire. But when he did, he introduced a peculiar characteristic that was never really an aspect of Roman paganism, and that was the aspect of charity, because he saw of all the things that the church had kind of provided, he saw that charity was really the decisive feature of the entire Christian community. And as a result, he kind of used that as a way to establish his new pagan religion and give this new pagan religion credibility, because the church had such a high degree, the Catholic Church had such a high degree of credibility because of its charity.
Right.
And it showed, Benedict is using this example to show how charity has always been a fundamental aspect of the church, even though the church is oftentimes criticized for appearing to be lavish or to spend money on, a curated art collection or large cathedrals and basilicas. But Benedict is saying, those criticisms can have other answers, but ultimately charity has always been a fundamental aspect of the church that even, the most secular societies in the world, Roman Empire at the height of its paganism, recognized that as a fundamental aspect.
And even though Julian acknowledged that or recognized that the charity of the church gave it a lot of credibility, Benedict is very clear that that's not why the charity exists, right? So it's not, the church doesn't exercise love towards the poor so that it gains credibility.
And the Romans were never really able to fully replicate
right, exactly.
it.
Because you can't fake it, right?
Right.
You can't fake charity.
Exactly.
And so for as many instances as the charity bought the church credibility, I'm sure there were 10 instances which it became the laughingstock, right? Of men like Nietzsche who pointed to those weak Christians, of multiple men who were sitting in emperor seats in Rome who sent Christians to their death in front of roaring animals, right?
Right. And then when you step out of the ancient world, you see in modernity an even sharper criticism almost against the church's acts of charity and charitable activity, especially when you look at, as Benedict points out, Karl Marx, right? This revolutionary now idea that the poor don't need your help, they don't need charity, they need justice.
Right.
So now we've taken what Marx is trying to do here is saying that acts of charity are bad, like giving people alms, helping them when they're in need. It's actually, in a sense, bad if you do it from charity, because in his eyes it validates the system, because it says, well, we live in this unjust society, but because there are some good people who are willing to do charity, it's still like it's good
acceptable,
enough. It's a good enough system, right? And it works. So Benedict kind of goes down this road of he even admits he says there's some truth to this argument, but more is mistaken. And what are some of the mistakes then that he kind of points out there?
Well, I think he's pretty clear in saying that Marxism doesn't work in practice, and market economies are better at lifting people out of poverty. But this is not a wholesale endorsement of capitalism at all. Nothing like that. What he's concerned with is that Marxism doesn't have the right starting principles in mind, right? And so charity is still very important. And he says, look, even in the most just society, if we could design a utopia and make it so that it was the most just society in the world, there would still be inequalities and injustices and deficits of love that the state would not be able to take care of. Mm-hmm. And that's what the church can do, right? Because the church can exercise charity in a way that the state simply cannot. Now, he doesn't say that charity is totally outside the purview of the state. And in fact, a good statesman should be very concerned with how to administer charity through the state. And Benedict talks at length about the Catholic social teaching that has, and he lists several encyclicals that have engaged at length in ideas of Catholic social teaching. But he says, again, unique to Christianity is this idea that from the words of Christ, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. So he says the church has a place in the temporal affairs of the world, but the church is not the state, and the church should never be in the role of the state.
And he specifically says that, the role of the state is, or at least the aim of a state is to create a just social order, right? And that ultimately the ordering of a society and a state is the central role of politics, not the church, right? But I think what he does here that is particularly powerful is he admits that sort of temporal authority, but then comes back and says, but if charity is the responsibility of the church, and ultimately love is going to be the responsibility of the church, then the way that the church plays a role in this ordering of society is not through the direct involvement in the ordering of the society, it's through the moral education of what justice is and towards what ends it should be oriented. Right. So it's not the place of the church to say, this political system or that political system is going to get us to the social state that we are aiming at, the just social state we're aiming at. But it is the role of the church to inform politics and the state as to what that end state actually looks like.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think I need to correct myself. I said that he was pretty clear on market economies. I don't think he actually mentions that in this. I think I'm confusing it with the different book I was reading last night from another Catholic thinker who is not a pope, but I don't want to give the impression that Benedict was making this a polemic about capitalism, because that's not at all what it is. And he mentions Marxism very specifically, but it's because of the underlying ideology of Marxism. It is not a capitalism versus Marxism discussion.
Right. And I want to go back to something that you said just a minute ago about how the attempt to really build a utopia is ultimately going to end with some aspects being left out. Right. And we saw this also in Plato. So Plato's dialogues, if you spend much time reading them, one of the things that begins to strike you, especially if you have a great professor who kind of points them out to you, as I did. But one of the things that starts to strike you is that Plato's dialogues are almost as notable for the things he leaves out of them as what is included in them. So when he talks about, for example, in his sort of philosophical utopia, the republic, the ideal society, the virtue that is completely left out of that society is love. The virtue that is left out in this case, since it is a Greek writing, is eros. So there is no marriage. Children are ripped away from their families at a very young age and become wards of the state. People don't love each other. There's no charity. There's no goodwill to outside societies, because to do so is taking away from the utopia itself. Right. So it raises very significant questions about what Plato is really telling us in that, and why certain schools of Platonic thought, which frankly, just to admit a bias, I particularly subscribe to, I find them to be more persuasive than some of the others. But they basically say that the Republic, while sort of a philosophical idea, is also a warning. And it's a question to us, like, this is possible. And I think socialism, Marxism, is an attempt to put into practice many of the things that Plato outlined in theory in the Republic. And we kind of see the destruction of the individual, right? When you look at Soviet society, absolutely, yeah, or communist Chinese society, you see the destruction of the individual. You see, in some cases, a lack of charity and love is kind of, there's an attempt to stamp it out. It ultimately, I think, wins out in the end. But what those dialogues do for us and what they present to us is they ask us a question: what are we willing to sacrifice for a quote unquote perfect society? For our perfect material society, are we willing to sacrifice virtues like love? And I think the resounding answer of humanity is no, because, as human beings who are bound to God, we can't live without those things.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really well said. And I like your take on the Platonic dialogue of the Republic.
Yeah.
I think that's good. And I also like what you said.
It's really not my take. It's someone much smarter than my take.
I like the way that you've
I've absorbed it.
Yeah, I like that. It's news to me. So how about that? I think you're right too, that this, the concern is about the destruction of the person, right? So I think the destruction of the individual is a little bit misleading, because Christianity is not really about the individual, but we are concerned about the person. And we're concerned about the person because God is concerned about the person, because God created the person, because the person bears the image of God, and because this person is totally, perfectly, and uniquely loved by God. And so whenever you have a system that attempts to destruct or deconstruct or diminish the person, that's a serious problem. And that's Benedict's concern here. It's not about holding up capitalism. In fact, he mentions, I think, only subsidiarity. I don't think he mentions capitalism. Like I said, I amended my previous comment. But he does talk about some of the challenges of modern day. He talks about mass interconnectedness and technology, and he says, look, this has enabled some good stuff, and that's certainly true. It's also
like the wide-reaching humanitarian aid.
Exactly,
great example of something that modern globalization has provided.
Exactly. It's also provided some problems, right? Civilizational friction. Not to mention, I mean, now we're even more acutely aware than we were in 2005 when he wrote this. So 14 years later, we're aware of how much of a problem screen time is for kids, right? Or for adults, how glued we are to our phones and how much that distracts from love of neighbor. So that's one. Increased cooperation between the church and the state agencies. Another one that has good and bad things, right? Because state agencies and the church, when working together, can provide massive amounts of good. But there's also the opportunity for increased friction, because sometimes state agencies want to do things that are not in accordance with how the church does charity, right? So I think, for example, of Melinda Gates, who's been a big proponent of sending condoms to Africa and using that as a main tactic for reducing HIV and AIDS on the continent. The church says, no, we're not going to distribute condoms, right? And so there is friction like that that can sometimes rise between the church and either big NGOs like the Gates Foundation or state agencies. And then there's the anti-culture of death, and I think he rightly calls it an anti-culture, because culture, just think of like cultures growing in a lab, cultures are life, right? You grow cultures, you cultivate a garden. The root of culture is all about life. So he rightly calls it an anti-culture. And here he's talking about not just things like abortion and euthanasia, although those are the most flagrant examples, but also, like we're talking about, a society or an ethic that devalues the human person. Sally and I, on our other podcast, Vernacular, talked with Charlie Camosi, who's a philosophy professor at Fordham University, and he has this new book about a culture of encounter, but he talks a lot about this idea that we can devalue the human person for the sake of a better society. And that's just devastatingly bad for society, and it's completely antithetical to the church, because it's antithetical to the love of God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and ultimately Benedict kind of rolls this up, and he talks about kind of three essential elements of Christian and ecclesial charity. The first is that it responds to an immediate need, right? In specific circumstances, you feed the hungry, you clothe the naked. This is the specific injunction that's provided to us by Christ. Go and do these things. It's not some abstract, let's try to order, things towards justice, and then hopefully people will get fed. No, someone's hungry, go feed them. Feed them first, right? That is the act of that it has to meet that immediate need. Second is that it's supposed to be completely independent of parties and ideologies, which I think is exactly what you were just going after, right? Is if you are being informed by, your charity is informed by this desire to, conform to some political ideology, or to, it's kind of a popular term, not too long ago, they talk about emanetize the eschaton, like bringing the
that's an Eric Vogelin phrase, yeah.
Exactly, bringing the perfect end state into the world, or like bringing the kingdom of God down into the kingdom of earth. But ultimately, it should be devoid of those sorts of things. It should come from a true wellspring of love, right? And then finally, the last one he talks about is that it should be a means. I'm going to use Benedict's exact words. He says, it cannot be used as a means of engaging in what is nowadays considered proselytism. And I know
that's a really big one.
Kind of brought this up a little bit, but what do you think? Why proselytism seems like a good thing if you want to go out and evangelize? So why do you think Benedict is saying charity should not be used for proselytism? Yeah,
I actually read this section twice because I had the same exact impulse. I was like, wait a minute, we want to. I mean, proselytize kind of has a negative word, but replace it with evangelism, right? So love should not be used as a means of evangelism. And I was like, wait, hold on, let me think about that one. Let me think that through a little bit. But he's right, I think, and this is why. So. He does not say evangelism is bad. And in fact, throughout the entire encyclical, he's very clear that, a mission of the church is to evangelize, right? That's one of the reasons that the church exists. He says that the threefold responsibility of the church is one is preaching and teaching the word, right? That is evangelism.
The kerygma.
Right. 2 is administering the sacraments. And 3 is exercising charity. So all of those 3 are indispensable to the mission of the church. And you can't have one effectively without the other, right? So that's, and they reflect the Trinity, so that is part of the Trinitarian exercise of the church's threefold responsibility. Okay, so with that said, Benedict is very clear about the necessity of evangelism and formation. What he's saying here about love and the way the church exercises charity is that it has to be unconditional. And so when you think about this, going back to the first section of this encyclical where he's reflecting on agape is unconditional love. And so what he's saying, I think, is that the exercise of charity by the church can never be conditioned by something else. We can't love people because then we can get them on our side, right? We can't love them only if they will come to church, right? We have to love them regardless of whether or not they love us back, or regardless of whether or not they love God back, right? So, and he even says in that section that the Christian will know when to speak and when not to speak.
Oh, I love that line.
Yeah. So he's not saying we can never evangelize in conjunction with loving. He's just saying
there's a time and a place for it.
Exactly.
Right?
And he's saying,
if you don't, if it's going to be true love, you show it through your act of charity. And as you're saying, you don't conditionalize it by then, making it an act of proselytization.
Exactly. It's not a contractual thing. It's not a transaction. Mm-hmm. It is self-giving, unconditional love, agape. We're about out of time, Kevin.
But I think this was dense.
I think we've gotten to the end of the encyclical, so it's probably an appropriate time to wrap up. I do want to just conclude by concluding the way that Benedict did it, and that's that at the end of this encyclical, he talks about Mary quite a lot, and he talks about other saints as well, at least in passing. And he says basically that these are, apart from Christ, obviously, who is the supreme and perfect model of charity, these are fantastic role models for charity because those are models to which we can aspire as well, right? And so he lists some of these saints that most of us have heard of, like Francis of Assisi, Ignatius of Loyola, St. John of God, Camillus of Lelis, which is, I always think it's kind of a funny name. He has a great story, though. I don't know if you know it, but
no, I don't.
You should look it up. He's pretty great. Vincent de Paul, Louise de Marillac, who I had not heard of. I'm not sure who she is, but John Bosco, Teresa of Calcutta, etc. And one story I just want to share real quick from Teresa of Calcutta. I'd heard about this before from her life, but he specifically mentions it in this encyclical. And Kevin, when you were talking about how to gain energy or gain renewal for this love so that you can then turn outward and express it from the church, the important thing is that you go to the Eucharist and you're repeatedly accessing the sacraments, go to confession, go to the Eucharist. And Teresa, obviously, dark night of the soul, right? She felt such serious despair and desolation for so much of the time that she was engaging in agape. The things that she did in the slums of Calcutta just take the cake for the model of Christian charity, right? Something that she told novitiates was that she could never have done that if she was not spending a lot of time, like hours per day in adoration in front of the Blessed Sacrament. So it was her adoration of Jesus Christ truly present among us in the Blessed Sacrament that enabled her outward charity towards other people, even when she really wasn't feeling it. And for much of her life, she wasn't feeling it because she experienced such dark despair.
Right. You have to love to be loved, right?
Right.
And if you're in a place where maybe you're not feeling particularly loved right now, go to confession, because even if you don't need it by definition, right? Even if you don't have mortal sin on your soul, go to confession, because you will feel, I can't say that you're going to feel better per se. You're not going to all of a sudden be happy. You're not going to walk out. But there is nothing more consoling than the words of absolution. There is nothing more consoling than experiencing that true kind of unconditional love that's bestowed upon you, that grace and confession. And, I think back to, even if you haven't been in a long time, I'll kind of give a personal example, which is rare for me, but there are two occasions I can really think about in kind of my adult Catholic life. And when I think about that, I really mean in my 20s, where I was not really devoutly practicing. It was kind of sporadic practicing, if you want to call it that. And two separate occasions, when I went to confession, I got to the opportunity to go there and kneel and say, "Bless me, Father, for I've sinned. It has been," and a number, and then the next word was years since my last confession. And that's always hard, but we're so blessed because the priests who I went to in those cases really modeled our gospel story again, bringing it back to that gospel story. The first words they said to me were, "Welcome home." So I would implore you, come home. The church is waiting for you.
So powerful. I too, like you were saying, it almost gives me chills when I'm in the confessional and I finish just spilling my soul and talking about how terrible I am, right? And then you hear God, the Father of mercies, and it's just like it just centers you.
And how can
right?
you not? After that, how can you not go out and love others?
How can you not? Right? I totally agree. Yeah. So, and I think just to wrap this all up, thank you for that story, Kevin. It is inspiring, and I encourage all of our listeners to go to confession if you're not doing so regularly already. We serve a God who loves us. Mm-hmm. That's the essence of this, right? So the encyclical is not called "The Church is Responsible for Loving."
Right.
That's not what I mean. That's a big part of it, and that's the case because that's a response to the actual title of the encyclical. But the encyclical is about our God, and our God is love, and He's not eros, and He's not philia. He's agape. He loves us unconditionally, regardless of what we do, and He doesn't need anything in return for that love to be real. That love is real, and we can respond to it, and we need to respond to it. So do that. Participate in the sacraments.
Love others.
Love others. Go exercise charity in the world. And thank you so much for listening to Creedal Catholic. We'd love it if you give us a review on Apple Podcasts. We got a 1-star review. Did you know that, Kevin?
Well, we didn't because that predated me. So that's on you. I got a perfect record still.
I got a 1-star review. I'm just going to, they didn't leave any words. So I'm just going to assume that they were confused on the rating system. And we're just thinking, 1 star is superior. 5 stars is it's like a 1 through 5 system where 1 is the best, 5 is the worst.
Sure.
But yeah, so we got a 1-star review.
And in that vein, email us. If we fraternally correct us and email us. So we'd love, constructive criticism is always welcome.
Yeah, constructive criticism or just questions. We'd love to take some questions from you if you have any questions for us. It doesn't have to be on this. It could just be on any topic in theology. If we don't know the answer, we'll research it for you and talk about it on the show because we love to find out the truth as well. So creedalcatholic@vernacularpodcast.com. Go leave us a rating or review on iTunes. 5 stars only, please. creedalcatholic@vernacularpodcast.com. We'll be back. I have an interview coming up next week with an interesting guest that I'm excited to release, and we'll be releasing that. Kevin wanted to be there for the conversation. I wanted him to be there as well, but right now we're limited. We only have 2 microphones.
2 microphones.
And we need 3 to have him here for an interview with the guest. But in the meantime, we'll be prepping the next episode of Encyclicalpedia, and we'll have another episode coming out soon. But if you have any topic suggestions or you want us to talk through a specific encyclical, let us know as well. creedalcatholic@vernacularpodcast.com. Thank you so much for listening, and God bless you.